Law at Work is sponsored by Perrett van Niekerk Woodhouse Macholo, leading labour law specialists representing businesses throughout South and Southern Africa, as well as Case Law, the quick, fast and easy labour law search engine.
Good evening and welcome to The Law at Work. I'm Simon Coleman. Employers contribute 1% of their wage bill to the Setas for the development of skills in South Africa. Comments have been made that the Setas may be failing to meet the challenge. With me in the studio is Ivor Blumenthal, CEO of the Services Seta, to share his insights. Welcome, Ivor.
Thank you.
Ivor, levies have been payable to the Setas via SARS since 2000.
Mm-hmm.
And of late, there have been some comments made, certainly by the Ministry of Finance, that perhaps the Setas aren't rising to the challenge. Can you comment on that?
Well, it's very interesting that those comments might have come from the Ministry of Finance, because I don't think they're accurate at all. And I really think they're an indication of the fact that the Ministry of Finance has no comprehension of what the skilling challenge is in this country, or in fact just how Setas are grappling to meet its mandate and the targets set in terms of the National Skills Development Strategy number 2. The reality is that Setas are doing phenomenal work. They're recognized as the Rolls-Royce of skills development within the Western world, quite frankly. We've been the laboratory of the European Union and many other countries for the last decade. And I think our achievements are phenomenal as a collective of 23 Setas.
Ivor, would you say that the PFMA, the Public Finance Management Act, has played a role in perhaps delaying the delivery of services from the Seta?
Now, I think what the PFMA has done is normalize the procurement process, which is sometimes very difficult to grapple with. Doesn't mean that there's anything wrong with the PFMA. It just means that it takes a while to learn to work within the scope and the direction of the Public Finance Management Act. The reality is procurement is a tricky thing, particularly within the government sector, and so you need that level of control. Initially, I was relatively critical of the PFMA, as if you want, a victim of it, running an organization which is subject to it. But for the last 7 years, we've had clean audit reports in terms of how we function in terms of the PFMA, and we've developed the machinery and we've learned about the intricacies of operating under it. And I have a lot of respect for it at this moment in time, I must say, particularly if you look at the recent Fidentia scandal and the fact that it is very clear on what should be done and what shouldn't be done. And the fact that there are still organizations which are not necessarily operating in terms of it doesn't mean there's anything wrong with the regulatory structure as opposed to the people who serve that structure.
Absolutely. Ivor, 1% of a company's wage bill is a substantial amount of money.
In many instances, it's not enough.
Okay.
The reality is that in many instances, it is far below the average of 7%, which pre-2000 companies were actually spending on training and development. And it was never intended to replace that 7%, but simply to deal with 1% of that, or seventh of that 7% at the very lowest levels, directed at remediation at the very lowest levels of employee within the company.
It's almost like the minimum standard has now become the standard.
Absolutely.
And everybody's contributing 1%.
That's precisely the problem. Many companies have dropped their training and education budget down to the skills levy component. And that's wrong. A good company spends a lot more than that, spends a lot more, in fact, than the 7% on training and development of its staff. And the better companies within our fold, certainly within our own Seta, are doing precisely that. 1% is a skills levy, supplementing it with a minimum of 6% in the ordinary course of training, development and mentoring and coaching, which goes on in the workplace.
Ivor, how can you ensure that the 1% that you are receiving is being used adequately? I mean, you mentioned procurement is a problem.
Sure. Well, we do it in two ways. We do it as a mandatory grant, where we actually quality control what a company uses 50% of its contribution, which we pay automatically back to it, what it uses that money for. So does it train its staff? Does it do recognition of prior learning activities, skill program work, certification work with its existing staff? And then over and above that, we give what we call discretionary grants, which are really about bringing unemployed people into the working environment, giving them a place of work, giving them a place to, possibly graduates, giving them a place to apply what they've learned within the education environment. And so by using both mandatory and discretionary grants, we quality control how they utilize that funding.
How are the service providers accredited? Because that seemed to be where there was a bottleneck occurring at some point.
The real bottleneck is in relation to the difference between a public provider and a private provider. Public providers are all handled through the Department of Education,
Right.
and historically have not gone through the Seta process or the SAQA process, the South African Qualifications Authority process. As far as private providers are concerned, there are very often bottlenecks because of the numbers of private providers out there who need to be accredited, and then who need their learning programs to be accredited. An average private provider can have between 15 and 20 learning programs, each of which needs to go through an accreditation process. So it certainly has been a bottleneck historically. We've streamlined the process tremendously. We've just been through a re-accreditation process of all of the providers we'd historically accredited.
Yes.
And I'm happy to say that while it began slowly, it's at full throttle.
Yes. Ivor, obviously you're the head of the services Seta.
Right.
In relation to some of the other Setas, and I think perhaps that's where Trevor Manuel's comment was directed initially, towards the end of last year. He mentioned that there were some inefficiencies in the Setas, and those needed to be looked at, and those Setas needed to be brought up. He also said that the answer wouldn't be to scrap the idea of using the Setas. That was a costly process. We'd already embarked, and there have been some successes. But in terms of how the other Setas need to get up to speed, do you have any comments on that?
Sure.
Or?
You know, it's very much something about critical mass.
Yes.
It's easy for a Seta such as ours, which is roughly a 300 million rand a year organization, to deliver on all of the targets in the National Skills Development Strategy. But the vast majority of Setas don't earn that type of money. They earn a fraction of it, and yet are still required to deliver on the same range of deliverables. And that's the first principal problem. The other problem, of course, is that the National Skills Fund, which is supposed to be there to supplement Seta work when Setas run out of money, has been redirected towards other government divisions and organizations and away from Setas. So as such, there's no safety net when Setas run out of money to be able to revert either to the National Skills Fund or, more importantly, to the Fiscus, to Trevor Manuel, and say, we have been so successful, we need more funding.
Yes.
In our own case, just in our Seta's case, over the last 5 years, we've turned away in excess of 80,000 applications, where our member companies have come to us and said, we're happy to bring graduates and currently unemployed people into our working environment for learnerships and for bursaries, etc., to learn about the working environment. We've had to turn away 80,000 of those applications because of a limitation of funds. If the Fiscus had been there, like it had promised right at the inception of Setas, and was able to kick in with additional supplementary funding, if we are on, for argument's sake, 500,000 people having benefited from the 23 Setas of the last 10 years, we could have easily doubled that number by now.
Right. So what can be done about that situation? I mean, how can that be changed?
I think it needs to be a realignment of funding which is available to Setas, more rather than less, obviously subject to all of the quality controls of the past, and I think Setas can do phenomenal work with additional funding.
Right. I think perhaps these success stories aren't publicized enough from
They don't
from the
make for
Setas.
good reading.
Yes, exactly. Ivor, that's all the time we have this evening. Thank you very much for joining me in the studio, and to you at home, goodbye.
Law at Work is sponsored by Perrett van Niekerk Woodhouse Macholo, leading labour law specialists representing businesses throughout South and Southern Africa, as well as case law, the quick, fast and easy labour